Hello, welcome to this new game review. So we'll have a look at a game from the Exchange Karakan and we'll see what we can take away. So it started, as mentioned, by ET and CD in the Karakan and the C4, which resembles the Panov variation. And the point is, white is going to get an isolated queen pawn, but he is going to try to compensate for his weakness with dynamics. And at least this is what he has to do. This is the whole point. If you get a static disadvantage, you have to compensate with dynamics. So let's see how this goes. So both sides develop the knights. Bishop g4. And here, the first kind of a small mistake by white is move bishop e2, which is very passive. We shouldn't play so passively when we have an isolated queen pawn. And I'm saying it's isolated because at some point these pawns will get exchanged. So white should try to get some kind of initiative, for example like this. Queen b3 is the main way people play here. And white is attacking b7, attacking d5. And the position is quite sharp. And white has his fair share of chances. But the point is, if white doesn't do anything quick, then he will just be left with a weakness here. So after bishop e2, now black took here. And white played this move bishop e3, which is also extremely passive. We cannot play like this, because now black has the advantage, as white's pieces are very passively placed, and black has a clear target on d4, and white doesn't have enough compensation for his weakness. For example, after e6, white will have to take on c4 at some point, and black will have enough time to develop his bishop, to castle, start to blockade the d-pawn, and white's bishop on e3 is very badly placed. Should be either on g5 or f4. So knight d5 instead was played, but now white castles. White could develop the opponent's queen to d5, which is more interesting, but castling is fine. Black takes the bishop, and at this point black not only has a pawn up, well, not really a pawn up, but black has the bishop pair, and he has less pawn islands in 2 pawn islands. But white is still fine, but only again if he plays dynamically. He has the f-file, he has some more space in the center, which should give him some compensation. So he takes bishop e7 and queen b3. So white is developing with tempo, attacking the pawn on b7, which black gives up to get some tempi in return. And at this point, white is a pawn ahead, but black does have the 2 bishops. The pawn white has is this b-pawn, so it's not really becoming a queen anytime soon. And white does have some weaknesses in the center, namely e3. And if the position opens up, black will be doing quite fine. At this point, black should play something like rook c8. For example, after queen d3, queen d6 maybe, put the bishop on f5, maybe play something like f5, f4 at some point, or queen b4. And black has good compensation for his pawn. After rook b8, white plays b3, and it's not that protecting the pawn is a bad move, but white had a good chance to improve his piece with tempo in knight e5, and in general, if we have a possibility to improve a piece without losing any time, we should take this opportunity. Knight e5, clearly the knight is better placed on e5, attacks the bishop, which means there's no time to take the pawn, and also there's some threat of a fork on c6. And in general, in chess, when we see a threat by the opponent, our last instinct should be to make a passive move like b3. The first instinct should be to do something ourselves. And if there's no active possibilities, then we play something passive like b3 or queen e2 or something else. So b3, rook c8, queen d3, bishop f5, e4. And here black plays the interesting exchange sacrifice, rook takes c3. Giving up a rook for a pawn and a knight. And this isn't too bad, but black didn't really have to do this. After bishop g6, black might even be a little bit better due to the somewhat weak e4 pawn. After, for example, bishop b4, the e4 pawn might drop, and in that case black will have a much better structure. This king will be quite weak, and the position is a bit unstable for white. Though at this point it is white to move, so he should be kind of fine. But now the position changes its character, and even though white is an exchange ahead for nothing, he is not that much better. He is a little bit better, but not that much. The bishop pair is very strong, and in general, sometimes the 2 bishops along with a pawn are better than a rook and a knight. Though here black doesn't have a pawn, so the rook and the knight are a little bit better. So rook a e1, though I believe white didn't really understand what he is trying to do here. At this point white does have a majority on the queen side, and it seems like the only plan to make progress here is to push the queen side. But okay, rook a e1, and then knight e5, so white is improving his pieces a bit. And at this point white could get a winning advantage by simply forking the pieces on e7 and d8. And if white takes away one of the bishops, then black will have no compensation for the exchange. This is kind of giving up the pawn on d4 with check. After king h1 and e5, white will have a big initiative here because black's pieces are very badly placed. After rook c1 or rook d1, the rooks are infiltrating, and white will win with his stronger pieces. Instead white goes back to c4, though here with 6 minutes surely we can find knight c6 to win the game. But here white is still better, but he is kind of struggling for a plan. Rook c1 and then rook d1, but again it's unclear why we are putting a rook behind our pawn. Again, white should just move his knight, try to push his queenside pawns at some point, maybe try to double the rooks on the c-file to infiltrate. But either way, we shouldn't make a move without coming up with some kind of plan in advance. Okay, rook fd1, black marks time. At this point black is kind of running out of time, white is doing well, but the advantage is kind of slipping at this point. After, for example, f5, this rook is a bit strangely placed. For example, rook f8, rook f4, the rook can go to c8, kicking the knight on c4, and the white's pieces aren't really ready for any sort of plan. It's not clear what white has been trying to do for the last few moves. But okay, e5 happens, and white takes, and here queen b7 was played, which simply loses the game due to a fork, but not rook d4. Again, white had more than 4 minutes, and here checks, captures, and attacks. Queen d3 is a check. It is not game over yet because black has f5, but white could give back the exchange, for example like this, and here an intermezzo, taking the pawn on g7 with a check, with the idea to take back here. At this point white has gotten the game into an endgame where he is 2 pawns up, so he has given up the exchange back, but he has the great passed pawn on e5, the untouchable knight on c4, his king has an easy path to the game, and white is simply technically winning. The game is over at this point. So this was a big chance missed by white. Something like knight d6 is also quite good. For example, if black takes, then we can take back, and now we have a passed pawn on d6, and also it can be very well supported by our pieces. But rook g to d4 allows the simple skewer bishop c5. Again, we shouldn't be blundering such tactics with so much time on our clock. The opponent finds this. Queen d3, king h8, and after this, and the queen b6, now even black is better. Now all of white's pieces are hanging. The big threat is f takes e5, after which the rook is attacked and the knight. So white moves his king, and black takes the exchange back. And at this point, if black had taken the pawn here, black would be doing quite well because he has a bishop against the rook. This one is not hanging because of checkmate. And after rook d1, for example rook f2, black is doing very well. He is attacking g2, attacking a2. His bishop is still untouchable, and the position is very uncomfortable for white, as the bishop is better than the knight, especially when there are pawns on both sides of the board. But bishop g8 happens. Now the game goes into this endgame, where white is a pawn ahead, and here white decides on the move h3. Of course, he did see that checkmate is threatened, but this is a very instructive moment, and we should understand our priorities in the endgame. Here there are a number of ways to not get mated in one move, right? There is rook d1 as a candidate move, then we can move the g pawn or the h pawn, but we can also move the king. The best move by far is king g1, because our king will at some point have to go to the center anyway. There is no point in giving ourselves lift if the king can use this time to go towards the center. And white is quite a bit better because he has a pawn, his pieces are quite well placed, he has the majority here, and he will try to work to create a passed pawn right there. Instead h3 happened, and now if black had played rook f2 for example, which was allowed now, then he would have quite enough compensation for the pawn. At a5, now again the best move was king g1, but white played knight c4, and this allows rook f2 and rook d2, but after the check, black has been able to exchange the bishop for the knight, and at this point the rook endgame is drawn, because even though white is a pawn up, he has the less active rook, which makes compensation for black. Though after this, a4, white should be able to get an endgame with a pawn advantage, though probably not really. The game is just petering out to a draw, and not much else happened, and the game was agreed to a draw here. So white did have his chances, both tactical chances, both chances in the endgame. And black tried to fight with quite a lot less time, and eventually he managed to draw. But white did have his chances, and I think he will regret not taking them.